Conspiracy theory. Two words that can shut down a conversation, make someone roll their eyes, or label you as that person. For decades, the phrase has been shorthand for paranoia, tinfoil hats, and late-night rants about lizard people. But I think the uncomfortable truth is that some conspiracy theories weren't theories at all. They were real and documented, carried out by governments, corporations, and institutions of power, and later admitted to, usually decades after the damage was already done. The same history books that reassure us of human progress also contain stories of men in lab coats injecting children with radioactive material, of intelligence agencies plotting terrorist attacks on their own soil, of entire communities unknowingly blanketed in clouds of chemical agents. For years, these were discussed on late-night phone calls, mocked, dismissed as crazy talk. Then the files got declassified. The survivors spoke. Congressional hearings were held. And suddenly, and almost overnight, crazy looked a lot like reality. I suppose you could say, as a lifelong conspiracy theorist, I feel vindicated by this. But the truth I've found, and you will too, isn't really something to be happy about. MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control program, the Tuskegee syphilis study, where black men were left to die in the name of science, Operation Northwoods, a Pentagon plan to stage fake terrorist attacks against Americans, COINTELPRO, the FBI's war against its own citizens. And that's just the start. This isn't about lizard people, as much as I'd like it to be, or hollow earth fantasies, which I have a lot of. This is about how the people in power behave when they think no one is watching, about how truth leaks out, slowly, stubbornly, even when the most powerful institutions in the world want it buried. And about what it means for us, today, living in an age of constant surveillance, corporate influence, and weaponized information. So while wearing your skeptic hat is a good thing, please don't leave your humanity behind, because the line between conspiracy theory and conspiracy fact is much thinner than most people want to believe. I think if there's one conspiracy theory that sets the gold standard for too crazy to be true, it's MK-Ultra. For decades, the idea that the CIA was secretly trying to control people's minds with drugs, hypnosis, and torture was laughed off as science fiction, until it wasn't. In the early 1950s, in the shadow of the Korean War and Cold War paranoia, the CIA launched a program so vast and so secretive that even the president wasn't fully in the loop. Its purpose was to figure out whether the human mind could be hacked. Could you erase memories? Could you implant new ones? Could you create a Manchurian candidate? An assassin who kills on command without knowing why? To find out, the CIA went hunting for guinea pigs, and they found them everywhere. Prisoners, psychiatric patients, soldiers, even some ordinary citizens. Consent wasn't just ignored, it was often seen as a liability. People were dosed with LSD for days, weeks, sometimes even months at a time. Electroshock therapy was pushed to extremes. Sensory deprivation, forced sleep, isolation, anything to break down the psyche and rebuild it in the agency's image. In one notorious program, sex workers on the CIA's payroll lured men into safe houses. Behind the two-way mirrors, agents watched as their drinks were spiked with hallucinogens. The project was called Operation Midnight Climax, and Joe Rogan loves to talk about this one. It sounds like bad Pulp Fiction, but it was real and paid for by taxpayer dollars. Some of the names attached to MK-Ultra went on to be infamous. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, the CIA chemist who became known as the Poisoner-in-Chief, ran the program with almost no oversight. Under his watch, LSD became not a party drug, but a weapon, a way to shatter minds and test the limits of human endurance. The human cost was unbelievable. Some subjects never recovered. Others committed suicide. Families were destroyed, their loved ones forever altered by experiments they never volunteered for. And for what? Even the CIA later admitted that the program produced no reliable techniques for controlling minds. Just chaos. I do disagree with that, but we'll talk about that another time. When MK-Ultra was exposed in the 1970s during the Church Committee hearings, the revelations shocked the world. But the full scope will never be known. Why? Because in 1973, as investigations loomed, the CIA destroyed most of the program's files. What we know today comes from scraps of paper that survived the purge, testimony from victims, and the occasional whistleblower who dared to speak. The bottom line is that MK-Ultra was real. It was vast. It was destructive. And it proved that what sounds like paranoia can, with time, reveal itself as historical fact. If MK-Ultra was the CIA's playground of psychological torture, then Tuskegee was the medical establishment's cruelest betrayal of trust. In Guatemala, that was worse. It was deliberate infection on foreign soil. Let's start with Tuskegee. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began what they called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. 600 poor black sharecroppers from Alabama were recruited with the promise of free medical care. 400 of them already had syphilis. 200 did not. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that covered everything from anemia to fatigue. They were given free meals, medical exams, and even burial insurance. What they weren't given was the truth. Because this was never about treatment. It was about observation. The doctors wanted to watch, for some reason, what syphilis did to the human body when left untreated. Even after penicillin was discovered in the 1940s as an effective cure, the men were deliberately denied access to it. Decades passed. The men suffered blindness, insanity, organ failure, and death. Wives contracted the disease. Children were born with congenital syphilis. The study ran for 40 years until 1972, when a whistleblower finally exposed it to the press. By then, dozens were dead, and the damage was irreversible. To me, the Tuskegee experiment stands as one of the most shameful episodes in American medical history. It was racism cloaked in science, the assumption that black lives could be experimented on for the greater good. The government eventually offered a formal apology in 1997, but only after generations had already suffered. And if you think Tuskegee was neglect, Guatemala was outright assault. From 1946 to 1948, U.S. doctors, working with the Guatemalan government, conducted a series of experiments on soldiers, prisoners, sex workers, children, and psychiatric patients. Their mission was not to watch untreated syphilis progress. It was to create syphilis, gonorrhea, and cankeroid in unsuspecting human beings. The methods were grotesque. Sex workers infected with syphilis were sent into prisons to sleep with inmates. When that wasn't enough, doctors directly injected men in the penis with bacteria. Okay, I felt weird saying that, but I had to. Psychiatric patients had their arms abraded and smeared with infected pus. Soldiers were infected through spinal punctures at the base of the skull. Some subjects were as young as 10 years old. None gave informed consent. Most had no idea what was being done to them. Roughly 1,300 people were deliberately infected. Many suffered horribly. Some died. And for decades, the experiments were buried. Only in the early 2000s did the full details come to light. It was only in 2010 that the US government formally apologized. But as with Tuskegee, an apology decades later doesn't erase the crimes. Together, I think Tuskegee and Guatemala can teach us a grim lesson. When institutions decide certain populations are expendable, ethics disappear, science becomes abuse, and what sounds like conspiracy theory, the government is infecting people with diseases, is tragically a part of historical record. I feel like this is going to be a really long rant, and I'm not sure when to stop talking, but Tuskegee and Guatemala weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger pattern, a dark history where human beings were treated as expendable test subjects in the name of science, medicine, or national security. Some of these experiments sound too horrific to believe, but they did happen, often in broad daylight, with government funding and the approval of respected institutions. Let's start. I guess we're not starting. I've been going for a little bit, but there was the Willowbrook State School in New York. In the 1950s and 60s, this institution housed children with intellectual disabilities, already some of society's most vulnerable people. Parents were told that their kids would receive vaccinations to protect them from hepatitis, a disease rampant in overcrowded facilities like Willowbrook. What they weren't told is that these so-called vaccines were actually deliberate infections. Children were fed food and drinks mixed with the feces of hepatitis patients. Yes, I actually just said that. You can look it up yourself. Others were injected with viral material. Doctors claimed it was necessary research to understand how hepatitis spread, but in reality, they were using disabled children as disposable test subjects. Then there was Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, right after World War II. You should look up the Vanderbilts. It's the family that Anderson Cooper is from. Researchers wanted to study how radioactive materials moved through the human body, so they turned to pregnant women seeking better prenatal care. They were told they'd be given vitamin drinks to improve the health of their babies. In reality, those drinks were laced with radioactive iron. At least 3 children later died from cancers and leukemia linked to the experiments. Hundreds of mothers and babies were put at risk without their knowledge. The Fernald School, or Fernald School, I don't know how to say it, in Massachusetts, took things a step further. Ostensibly a school for feeble-minded boys, Fernald was tied to America's eugenics movement. Many of the boys were wards of the state, abandoned by their families, or taken into custody because of learning disabilities. These children were fed radioactive oatmeal. Yes, radioactive oatmeal, in studies sponsored by MIT and Quaker Oats. To convince the boys to participate, researchers formed something they called the Science Club. They gave the children extra privileges, like trips to baseball games, in exchange for eating breakfasts laced with radioactive isotopes. These weren't minor doses either. They were significant enough to track how radiation was absorbed in bones and tissues. The children, of course, were never told the truth. And it wasn't just radiation. In the 1990s, which to some of you probably seems like a million years ago, reports emerged that foster children with HIV in states like New York, Illinois, and Texas had been enrolled in clinical drug trials without proper consent. These kids were given highly toxic experimental antiretroviral drugs. Nurses later revealed that when the children vomited, seized, or lost their ability to walk, it was blamed on their HIV infection, not the drugs. Caregivers who questioned the treatments were threatened with losing custody of the kids. In some cases, children were forcibly taken from relatives who tried to stop the medication. Internationally, abuses continued under the guise of medical care. In the 1990s and 2000s, Ethiopian Jewish women in Israel reported being given birth control injections, often Depo-Provera, without their informed consent. Many said they were told these injections were routine inoculations. Others were pressured to accept them or risk losing access to social services. The result was a dramatic drop in birth rates within Ethiopian immigrant communities, raising some pretty strange questions about racism, assimilation, and population control. And I know I'm not really going in chronological order, but I forgot to mention Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's notorious research division during World War II. Stationed in occupied Manchuria, Unit 731 conducted human experiments on a scale that dwarfed most Western programs. Prisoners of war, including Chinese civilians, Russians, and even captured American airmen, were subjected to atrocities that rivaled the worst of Nazi Germany. Victims were frozen alive to study frostbite, had limbs amputated and reattached in different positions, or were even in some cases dissected without anesthesia. Diseases like plague, cholera, and anthrax were deliberately introduced into villages to study mass infection. Thousands died each year. After the war, instead of facing justice, many of Unit 731's scientists were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. Another ugly case where justice was sacrificed for military advantage. From what I can see, the thing that ties all these experiments together is the same pattern. Vulnerable people, children, the disabled, prisoners, minorities, immigrants, targeted because they couldn't fight back. Doctors and governments justifying the unjustifiable in the name of progress. And decades later, when the truth came out, the victims were left with little more than apologies, if that. When people say, the government would never do something like that, I think if we look at history, we can say they already did. I know some of this is hard to listen to, so if you have to take a break, I understand. But if you thought the human experiments were dark, this next layer takes things out of the lab and into the open air. Because for decades, the US and its allies didn't just experiment on individuals, they experimented on entire populations. Cities became test tubes. Civilians became test subjects, and no one was told. Let's start with Operation Sea Spray in San Francisco. In September 1950, the U.S. Navy loaded a ship with canisters of a bacterium called Serratia marcescens. You have no idea how many times I practiced saying that. The ship cruised just off the coast and for 6 days released clouds of bacteria into the air, blanketing the city of San Francisco and its surrounding suburbs. Why? To test how vulnerable a major urban center might be to a biological weapons attack. The military thought Serratia was harmless, a red pigmented bug that stained bread and flour but wasn't considered dangerous to people. That assumption turned out to be tragically wrong. Within a week, 11 residents were admitted to Stanford Hospital with rare, serious urinary tract infections caused by Serratia. One man, Edward Nevin, died after complications from an infection in his heart. At the time, doctors had no idea why they were suddenly seeing this strange outbreak. Only decades later, when the experiment was revealed, did it become clear that an entire metropolitan area had been used as an unwitting petri dish. San Francisco wasn't alone. Across the country, the government was conducting secret tests, often targeting vulnerable communities. In the 1950s and 60s, the Army set up motorized blowers on the rooftops of housing projects and schools in St. Louis, Missouri. These weren't just any neighborhoods. They were predominantly black, low-income areas. Residents were told the city was testing a smokescreen that might protect them in the event of a Soviet attack. But what was actually being sprayed into the air was zinc cadmium sulfide, a fine powder that glowed under certain conditions. Later evidence suggests that radioactive particles may also have been mixed in. Children played outside as the blowers coated their homes, their clothes, and their lungs. The government picked St. Louis, officials admitted years later, because the city's dense urban layout resembled that of Soviet cities the US might one day target. And then there's Dugway Proving Ground, a remote testing site in Utah. In March 1968, a routine test went catastrophically wrong. The Army released the nerve agent VX, one of the deadliest chemical weapons ever created. Winds shifted, and the gas drifted beyond the testing range. By morning, nearly 6,400 sheep lay dead in the surrounding Skull Valley. Their carcasses were scattered across the desert floor, a surreal, horrifying sight. At first, the Army denied responsibility, but as ranchers demanded answers, it became clear that the sheep had been collateral damage in America's chemical weapons program. If VX could kill thousands of sheep overnight, what would it do in a city? That was the unspoken point of the test. These weren't isolated accidents. The US military ran a program called Operation Large Area Coverage, or LAC, designed to see how far biological or chemical agents might spread if released into the atmosphere. Between 1957 and 1958, aircraft sprayed microscopic zinc cadmium sulfide particles over vast swaths of the United States and Canada. Entire regions, from the Midwest to the Southeast, were dusted with the particles. The idea was to measure dispersion patterns, but the people below had no idea that they were breathing in potentially toxic materials. And I know this has been pretty US focused so far, but this wasn't just America. Its allies were in on the game. A 2002 British government report revealed that between 1940 and 1979, the UK conducted more than 100 secret biological weapons trials. In some, planes flew from northeast England down to Cornwall, releasing clouds of zinc cadmium sulfide along the coast. In others, scientists carried out what became known as the DICE trials in Dorset, spraying massive amounts of bacteria like E. coli and Bacillus globigii. Microbes chosen because they mimicked anthrax without technically being anthrax. The populations of southern England, more than 1 million people, were exposed without ever knowing. Canada, too, was a test site. During the Cold War, Winnipeg and towns in Alberta were sprayed with carcinogenic chemicals by the US military, and Ottawa was never informed. The pattern is unmistakable. Again and again, governments decided that the health and safety of their own citizens were expendable in the pursuit of military knowledge. The justification was always the same. We have to be ready if the Soviets attack. But readiness came at the cost of trust, safety, and in some cases, lives. When survivors of these tests later developed illnesses, cancers, respiratory problems, neurological disorders, they were often dismissed. Correlation, not causation, the officials said. But when you look at the sheer number of experiments, the sheer scale of exposure, it's clear that millions of people were treated as human guinea pigs in what amounted to open-air laboratories. So the next time someone tells you that the governments would never put their own populations at risk, remember San Francisco, remember St. Louis, remember Dugway and Skull Valley, because history says otherwise. Up to this point, which I know it's been a while, if you're still listening, hi. We've seen governments experiment on their own people and unleash weapons tests over unsuspecting cities. But sometimes the story isn't about experiments at all. If there's one example that shows how far a government will go to silence its critics, it's COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. For years, the idea that the FBI was actively sabotaging civil rights leaders, peace activists, and political groups was dismissed as paranoia. But when the documents were leaked in the 1970s, the conspiracy turned out to be not only true, but bigger and uglier than anyone imagined. COINTELPRO began in 1956 under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. On paper, the program's goal was to protect national security. In practice, it was about maintaining the status quo, crushing dissent, discrediting movements, and protecting the social and political order as Hoover saw it. And he saw enemies everywhere: communists, feminists, anti-war protesters, environmentalists, civil rights groups, Puerto Rican independence activists, Native American leaders, even the Ku Klux Klan. The Bureau wasn't picky. If you challenged authority, you were a target. The tactics were wide-ranging and ruthless. Agents infiltrated organizations, planted informants, and spread false rumors to sow division. They mailed anonymous letters designed to turn activists against each other, accusing leaders of being informants themselves or of betraying their own causes. They forged documents, leaked fake stories to the press, and even tried to break up marriages. One of the most infamous examples is the FBI's campaign against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Bureau wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and collected tapes of his private life. In 1964, they mailed him an anonymous letter suggesting he kill himself, accompanied by recordings meant to humiliate him. The letter taunted, "There's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is." This wasn't some fringe extremist group. This was the FBI. And it wasn't just King. The Black Panther Party was relentlessly targeted. Leaders like Fred Hampton were smeared, harassed, and infiltrated. In 1969, Hampton was killed in a police raid in Chicago, later revealed to have been aided by the FBI. Mark Clark, another Panther, died that night too. The Bureau labeled the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country and worked to ensure they were neutralized through arrests, intimidation, and, some critics argue, outright assassinations. COINTELPRO didn't stop at civil rights. During the Vietnam War, anti-war activists found themselves under surveillance. College campuses were infiltrated. Entire movements were smeared as communist fronts, even when they were made up of ordinary Americans calling for peace. Native American activists with the American Indian movement were similarly targeted, with leaders like Leonard Peltier, or is it Peltier, prosecuted under highly questionable circumstances. The program came to light in 1971 when a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole files. Those files were mailed to journalists and exposed COINTELPRO for what it was: a massive, covert assault on constitutional rights. Later, congressional investigations confirmed the worst. The FBI had engaged in perjury, intimidation, wrongful imprisonment, illegal surveillance, and even violence against American citizens. And while officially COINTELPRO was shut down in 1971, many of its tactics live on. From the Occupy Wall Street movement to Black Lives Matter, activists have long suspected infiltration and coordinated crackdowns. In 2012, declassified documents revealed that the FBI, Homeland Security, and even big banks had worked together to surveil and disrupt Occupy protests. Peaceful demonstrators were treated as terrorist threats. The echoes of COINTELPRO still reverberate. The lesson is chilling but clear. When those in power feel threatened, they don't just debate you, they don't just disagree. They find ways to discredit you, divide you, and destroy you. And COINTELPRO is proof that sometimes the conspiracy isn't a theory at all. It's a government file stamped top secret. I'm I'm pretty nervous talking about this, but the phrase false flag gets thrown around a lot these days, usually to dismiss some half-baked 4chan rumor. But the concept has a very real history. A false flag is when a government carries out an attack and blames someone else, often to justify war or crackdowns at home. And the shocking truth is, some of the most notorious theories about false flags have turned out to be true. Let's start with one of the most famous cases in American history, Operation Northwoods. In 1962, as the U.S. planned its next moves against Fidel Castro's Cuba, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted a proposal. They wanted to stage acts of terrorism against American citizens and blame it on Cuba. The document laid out ideas that sound like a bad movie: hijacking planes, sinking refugee boats, staging bombings in Miami and Washington, even faking the death of astronauts. The goal? To generate outrage that would justify an invasion of Cuba. President Kennedy rejected the plan, but the fact that U.S. military brass seriously considered murdering and terrorizing Americans to start a war should make anyone's blood run cold. False flags weren't just on the American playbook. In 1954, Israeli intelligence carried out a covert operation in Egypt, later known as the Lavon Affair. The plan was simple: recruit Egyptian Jews to plant bombs in U.S. and British-owned civilian targets, libraries, cinemas, even American cultural centers. The bombs would then be blamed on Egyptian nationalists, souring Egypt's relations with the West. The plot was exposed, the agents were arrested, and Israel denied involvement for decades. It was only in 2005 that the surviving operatives received official recognition from the Israeli government. What had once been a smear against Israel turned out to be entirely real. And then there's the Katyn massacre. Katyn? I'm just going to say Katyn massacre. In 1940, Stalin's secret police executed more than 20,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and civilians in one of the worst war crimes of the century. For decades, the Soviet Union blamed the Nazis, insisting that Germany had carried out the killings. Anyone who questioned the Soviet narrative was called a propagandist. But after the fall of the USSR, declassified documents confirmed the truth. It had been Stalin's order all along. The world had lived under a false narrative for 50 years. In 2003, we see echoes of the same playbook. A leaked, extremely sensitive memo revealed that President George W. Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair discussed ways to provoke Saddam Hussein into a confrontation. One idea was to fly U-2 spy planes over Iraq, painted in UN colors, hoping Saddam would shoot them down. Another was to find or create a defector who could publicly reveal Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. When those weapons never materialized, the war had already begun, justified on a foundation of manipulation and deceit. History is littered with other examples. The CIA's Project TP Ajax in Iran in 1953 involved staging attacks on mosques and blaming them on communists loyal to Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. It was part of a coup that toppled Iran's democratically elected leader and installed the Shah, ensuring Western oil interests remained intact. In 1985, French intelligence agents bombed and sank Greenpeace's ship, the Rainbow Warrior, in a New Zealand harbor to prevent protests against nuclear testing. One crew member died. France initially blamed terrorists. Years later, they admitted it was their own operation. And of course, James Bond. Even Britain's MI6 got its hands dirty. Newly declassified records show that they ran Operation Embarrass in the late 1940s, planting explosives on ships carrying Jewish Holocaust survivors to Palestine. The goal was to stop Jewish immigration and appease Arab states. British intelligence actually considered blowing up the famous Exodus ship, the one that carried refugees who later helped found the State of Israel. The pattern repeats again and is unmistakable. False flag operations are not internet fever dreams. They're documented strategies used by governments, sometimes admitted decades later, sometimes never officially acknowledged at all. And each time, the justification is the same. National security, greater good, higher stakes. But the cost is always trust, lives, and the truth itself. So the next time you hear someone scoff at the idea of a false flag and ghost you from their life, remember Northwoods, remember Levon, remember Katyan. I think that's how you say it. These weren't just theories. There were plans, carried out or nearly carried out, written in the ink of classified memos and sealed with the blood of real people. I think if you want to understand how power shapes perception, you don't just look at wars or weapons, you look at stories. Because stories shape what we believe, they guide the narrative and public opinion. They convince us who the heroes are, who the villains are, and what battles are worth fighting. And for decades, intelligence agencies have quietly worked to make sure the story you hear is the story they want you to believe. One of the earliest and most well-known examples is Operation Mockingbird. Starting in the late 1940s, the CIA began recruiting journalists, editors, and media executives, both in the US and abroad. The idea was simple but powerful. If you control the flow of information, you can shape public perception without firing a shot. According to congressional testimony in the 1970s, the CIA had assets in virtually every major media outlet: the New York Times, Time Magazine, CBS News, even Hollywood studios. Some journalists were paid directly, others were simply fed information and asked to frame it the right way. In some cases, entire stories were written by the agency and handed to friendly reporters for publication. The purpose wasn't just to make America look good. It was to wage psychological war. During the Cold War, Mockingbird planted stories painting foreign leaders as corrupt or unstable, stoking coups and revolutions. At home, it was used to undermine activists, discredit whistleblowers, and diffuse criticism of government policies. If someone questioned US involvement abroad, a conveniently timed op-ed might appear questioning their patriotism or motives. This wasn't a debate, it was an attempt at control. The relationship between government and entertainment runs even deeper than most of us think. Declassified documents revealed that the Pentagon and CIA have quietly influenced more than 1,100 TV shows and movies. This goes far beyond just technical assistance, like lending a jet for a scene in Top Gun, or a tank for a war drama. It comes with strings attached. In exchange for access to equipment, bases, or personnel, filmmakers agree to let the military review and alter scripts. The result is that blockbusters like Transformers or Iron Man end up doubling as recruitment ads, portraying the US military as glamorous, efficient, and heroic, while glossing over scandals, failures, or controversial wars. The CIA even had a hand in shaping films like Zero Dark 30. Behind the scenes, agency officials worked with filmmakers to promote the idea that enhanced interrogation techniques, in plain English, torture, played a crucial role in finding Osama bin Laden. Years later, the Senate torture report concluded that wasn't true, but by then, the Hollywood version of events had already cemented itself inside the public mind. Torture had been rebranded as a grim necessity, thanks to a movie night at the mall. My throat is really messed up from talking so much. And this manipulation isn't just historical. In 2008, The New York Times exposed a Pentagon program that secretly fed talking points to retired military generals who appeared on television as independent analysts. These men were given access, perks, and briefings, then went on the air to sell wars and defense contracts, without disclosing they were essentially part of a government-run PR campaign. These were psychological operations aimed not at enemies abroad, but at the American public. The thread running through all of this is the idea that information is a battlefield. When people say, the media is lying to you, it's easy to dismiss it as conspiracy thinking, but history shows that at times the media has been co-opted, not accidentally, but by design. So the next time you see a war movie, or hear a general on cable news, or read a suspiciously well-timed op-ed, it's worth asking, whose story is this really? Because as Operation Mockingbird showed us, the battle for hearts and minds isn't fought with bullets. It's fought with words, headlines, and media. And in that war, the truth is often the first casualty. My voice keeps changing because of hydration levels, but I'm just gonna keep going. I don't even know if I'm going in any kind of sensible order anymore, but there's a lot more to talk about. I think if you really want to test the line between conspiracy theory and reality, all you have to do is look at surveillance. For decades, people have talked about the government spying on its own citizens, monitoring calls, opening mail, infiltrating communities. And for decades, officials dismissed it as paranoia. Then the documents started leaking, and all the whispering turned into hard evidence. Let's rewind, if anyone listening to this still remembers what rewinding is, to the 1960s. The CIA, by law, is forbidden from conducting operations on American soil, but that didn't stop them. Programs like Operation Chaos, Project Merrimack, and Project Resistance were explicitly designed to spy on U.S. citizens. Chaos amassed files on Americans suspected of being domestic dissidents, with particular focus on anti-war activists and black liberation movements. Merrimack infiltrated peace groups to monitor any potential threats against CIA facilities. Resistance compiled intel on college campuses, flagging radical professors and student groups. By the early 1970s, the CIA had built files on over 7,000 individuals and 1,000 organizations, ordinary Americans who had no idea they were being watched. The FBI, who we already talked about, ran COINTELPRO. The NSA was running a secret program called Project Shamrock, which vacuumed up telegraph traffic. Every major telegraph company in the US handed copies of their transmissions to the NSA daily. By the 1970s, Shamrock was pulling in over 150,000 messages a month. No warrant, no oversight. Just bulk collection, decades before Edward Snowden would show the same thing happening with your emails and phone calls. And then there's Project Minaret. From the 1960s into the 70s, the NSA maintained secret watch lists of Americans considered subversive. Who made the list? Anti-war protesters, journalists, even senators. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was on it, Muhammad Ali was on it, senators like Frank Church and Howard Baker, who would later investigate the program, discovered they had been targeted themselves. Fast forward to the post-9/11 era, and the surveillance state only grew more powerful. The Patriot Act legalized many of the very things previous generations had fought to shut down. Snowden's leaks in 2013 revealed PRISM, a program where the NSA tapped into servers at Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple, collecting emails, photos, chats, and documents from millions of people around the world. Bulk phone metadata collection meant your calls, who you dialed, how long you talked, where you were all logged. Officials swore it was only foreigners, but the documents proved otherwise. And it wasn't just the NSA. A CIA Inspector General's report later revealed that agency officers had been embedded within the New York Police Department after 9/11. One officer, technically on leave from the CIA, carried out surveillance operations on American soil. Another, still on CIA payroll, had direct access to NYPD intelligence reports, including information about American citizens that had nothing to do with foreign intelligence. In other words, the CIA's domestic spying ban was just another legal fig leaf. Globally, the picture was even bigger. Programs like Echelon, a top-secret alliance between the NSA, GCHQ in Britain, and intelligence agencies in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, created a global dragnet. Each partner would spy on foreigners and conveniently share intel with allies, skirting domestic laws. Britain's GCHQ can't spy on Brits, the NSA can't spy on Americans. But they can spy on each other's citizens and swap the data. It's a loophole that makes "we don't spy on our own people" basically meaningless. And journalists weren't off limits. In the 1960s and 70s, as mentioned before, the CIA ran Project Mockingbird, not to be confused with the media infiltration program, where it wiretapped reporters and followed them, trying to trace their sources. President Nixon himself had CIA observation posts set up across from journalists' offices. In more recent years, the Department of Justice admitted to secretly seizing the phone records of Associated Press reporters. If you boil it down, because boiling down is fun, the surveillance state is a conspiracy theory that came true over and over again. Government agencies denied, obfuscated, and lied until they were caught. And when they were caught, the justification was always the same: we're keeping you safe. But what history shows us, I think, is that safety often comes at the expense of freedom. And once the surveillance apparatus is in place, it rarely disappears. So if you've ever wondered whether you're being watched, the answer is a simple yes. Maybe not you personally, maybe not today, but in the dragnet world of modern surveillance, you're already in the net. The only question is when someone decides to tug on the line. If I'm being honest, I want to stop recording this, because talking about this stuff makes me nervous. But I think when we get into conspiracy theories, finance is usually where eyes glaze over. It's complicated, at least for me. It's boring, and it's hidden behind jargon. But that's exactly why the financial sector is the perfect place for a conspiracy to thrive. Because the global banking system has been rigged again and again, and every so often, the mask slips. Take the LIBOR scandal, the London Interbank Offered Rate. For decades, LIBOR was the benchmark interest rate that set the cost of borrowing worldwide. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, corporate debt, trillions of dollars were tied to it. Banks were supposed to submit honest estimates of what it cost them to borrow from each other, and those estimates got averaged out. But instead, the biggest banks on earth, Barclays, Citigroup, JP Morgan, UBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, colluded to lie. Traders openly conspired in chat rooms with names like the cartel and the mafia, nudging rates up or down to benefit their bets. Regulators later uncovered the messages where traders joked about being honest and getting rich. The result? Entire economies manipulated, billions skimmed, and millions of ordinary people paying higher loan rates, all so bankers could pocket bigger bonuses. Then there's the foreign exchange scandal. I can't think of anything better to call it, which was basically LIBOR 2.0. The same banks were caught colluding to rig the 5.3 trillion a day currency market. Traders swapped inside info and timed trades to move exchange rates in their favor, robbing clients who trusted them. The fines added up to billions, but not one senior executive went to prison. And if that wasn't enough for you, banks have also served as laundromats for drug cartels and terrorists. In 2012, HSBC admitted it had laundered nearly $1 billion for the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico and Colombia. They literally redesigned teller windows in Mexico so boxes of drug cash would fit through them. They also moved money for Saudi and Bangladeshi banks tied to terrorism. The punishment, a $1.9 billion fine. That sounds big until you realize HSBC made $22 billion in profit that year. To them, it was the cost of doing business. Wachovia Bank, later bought by Wells Fargo, was caught laundering $378 billion for Mexican cartels. That's not a typo. $378 billion. Planes bought with the Wachovia money were later found loaded with tons of cocaine. What was the fine? Less than 2% of the bank's annual profits, and nobody went to jail. Deutsche Bank, Germany's largest financial institution, was fined $425 million for laundering $10 billion out of Russia through sham trades. Investigators found evidence of massive money flows tied to oligarchs and organized crime. Again, just a slap on the wrist. Business as usual. And I know this might not be something our younger listeners remember, but there was the mortgage crisis of 2008. The largest banks in the world knowingly packaged toxic subprime mortgages, stamped them with AAA ratings, and sold them as safe investments. When the house of cards collapsed, millions lost their homes, jobs, and savings. The banks, they got bailouts. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, and others paid fines in the billions, but those fines were fractions of the profits made. As one executive reportedly said, "We'll just write a check." Since the 2008 crash, global banks have paid over $300 billion in fines for fraud, money laundering, and misconduct. But here's the key detail. Those fines were paid by shareholders, not the executives who made the decisions. Nobody went to prison for destroying the global economy. Nobody went to prison for laundering drug money. And nobody went to prison for conspiring to rig markets. So when someone says the system is rigged, it's not a metaphor. It's the literal truth. The same banks that advertise trust and stability have been caught over and over again behaving like criminal enterprises. And the governments that are supposed to police them, more often than not, they intervene to keep the banks afloat because the system depends on them. What we're left with is the sobering realization that conspiracy in finance isn't about shadowy cabals and smoke-filled rooms, though they do that sometimes. It's about emails, chat logs, and wire transfers. It's about institutions so big that they can break the law in broad daylight and pay a fine without breaking stride. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's just the business model. And I know this has been going for a while, and I don't know when it's going to stop, but when we think of conspiracy theory, we often imagine smoke-filled rooms or secret labs. But some of the darkest betrayals of public trust didn't require classified programs or shadowy spies. They happen in broad daylight, in our drinking water, in the air we breathed, and in the soil beneath our feet. They weren't just innocent accidents by giant corporations. They were cover-ups. Take the Flint water crisis, which drew global attention in 2015. Residents of Flint, Michigan complained for months that their water smelled foul, looked dirty, and made them sick. Officials insisted it was safe. Behind the scenes, though, testing had revealed elevated levels of lead, a neurotoxin that permanently damages children's brains. The real scandal wasn't just the contamination, it was the cover-up, the deliberate manipulation of data to downplay how dangerous the water had become. Emails later showed state officials dismissing concerns, cherry-picking numbers, and using testing methods specifically designed to produce lower lead levels. Flint wasn't an isolated case either. Investigations revealed that 5,300 water systems across the U.S. were in violation of lead laws, many fudging or distorting test results. This was a systemic problem. New York City had its own scandal. In 2016, the city's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene was caught falsifying records to show that daycare centers' water had been tested for lead, when in fact no tests were performed at all. Parents were told their children were safe. They weren't. I think the water stuff goes even deeper. A 2009 New York Times investigation found that the Clean Water Act had been violated more than 500,000 times since 2004. More than 23,000 companies and facilities, from factories to municipal plants, dumped toxic waste into rivers and lakes. The records were public, but regulators looked the other way. Polluters filled their own reports, and agencies rarely enforced consequences. This cover-up was hidden in plain sight, buried in paperwork. Sometimes, the cover-ups lasted decades. In Crestwood, Illinois, for nearly 40 years, 11,000 residents were served tap water secretly laced with cancer-causing chemicals. Officials knew. Federal agents eventually raided the village hall, the Department of Public Works, and the police station. The betrayal was staggering. Not strangers, but local leaders had poisoned their own community. And it wasn't just incompetence, sometimes it was organized crime. In southern Italy, the mafia made billions dumping toxic industrial waste into farmland and aquifers. Families drank water laced with carcinogens. Children were born sick. Cancer rates soared. And when residents demanded answers, they found themselves staring down not just corrupt politicians, but the lethal silence of the mob. As one grieving parent put it, "They've poisoned our land and stolen our children." Even the agencies meant to protect us weren't immune. After 9/11, EPA officials publicly declared the air around Ground Zero safe to breathe. They knew it wasn't. Internal documents later revealed that asbestos, lead, and other toxins were present at levels that endangered first responders and residents. The EPA had been pressured by the White House to reassure the public so businesses could reopen downtown. Firefighters, police officers, cleanup crews, and civilians paid the price with chronic illnesses, cancers, and lost lives. The thing that ties all these stories together is simple. The problem isn't just pollution, it's deception. Officials, corporations, and agencies made conscious choices to hide the truth. They manipulated tests, falsified reports, downplayed risks, and delayed action, all to save money, protect reputations, or avoid lawsuits. The result was thousands of lives destroyed not by natural disasters, but by the lies. When people say, "I don't trust the government," or "I don't trust corporations," I think this is why. Because again and again, the institutions tasked with protecting the public chose to protect themselves instead. This is just history. I feel like few industries inspire as much unease as pharmaceuticals. On one hand, they produce life-saving drugs. On the other, history is littered with scandals that show how profit can outweigh patient safety, and how regulators meant to protect the public sometimes become partners in the deception. Take Merck's Vioxx scandal. Vioxx was a superstar painkiller, marketed as safer than older anti-inflammatories. Millions of prescriptions were written, but internal documents later revealed the company knew early on that Vioxx increased the risk of heart attacks and strokes. Instead of pulling it immediately, Merck launched what employees literally called a hit list. Doctors who questioned the drug's safety were labeled for neutralization, discrediting, or in the company's own words, seeking them out and destroying them where they live. By the time Vioxx was pulled in 2004, it was estimated to have caused tens of thousands of premature deaths. Then there's the opioid epidemic, which I mention all the time. A crisis so vast it feels almost impossible to capture. Since the 1990s, pharmaceutical giants aggressively marketed opioids like OxyContin as safe and non-addictive, despite knowing the opposite was true. Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, trained its sales force to convince doctors that patients showing signs of addictions were actually experiencing pseudo-addiction, a fake condition that supposedly meant they needed even more opioids. Charts were fabricated, research cherry-picked, and regulators bought in. The FDA, whose opioid approval division now gets 75% of its funding from the industry itself, was accused of running a pay-to-play system. The result was over 500,000 opioid-related deaths in the US alone. The companies walked away with billions. The families were left with funerals. GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, offers another example. In 2012, the company paid a record $3 billion fine after admitting to bribing doctors, manipulating data, and promoting antidepressants like Paxil and Wellbutrin for uses never approved by regulators, including prescribing Paxil to children, despite evidence it could increase suicidal thoughts. Sales reps were encouraged to shower doctors with perks, trips, cash, even worse in some markets, to push prescriptions. In China, the head of GSK's operations was found guilty of running what authorities described as a criminal godfather scheme, involving hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes. But Insys Therapeutics was a company that epitomized corporate depravity. Their flagship drug was Subsys, a fentanyl spray meant strictly for cancer pain. Executives built an entire nationwide bribery network, paying doctors to prescribe the spray to patients who didn't need it. They staged fake speaker programs where doctors were paid lavishly for events that never happened. They even hired an exotic dancer to pose as a sales trainer. All the while, executives watched profits soar as patients spiraled into addiction. Eventually, CEO John Kapoor was arrested and convicted. One of the rare times big pharma executives actually saw prison time. And this is systemic. The corruption isn't just about individual companies. A 2009 letter from FDA staff to President Obama described systemic corruption and wrongdoing that permeates all levels of FDA. Clinical trials are often ghostwritten by pharma companies, with doctors putting their names on research they didn't conduct. Negative studies will disappear into file drawers, while positive ones are cherry-picked for publication. Former editors of leading medical journals like The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine have bluntly stated that much of the public medical literature can no longer be trusted. Even life-saving medicines have been treated as bargaining chips. In 2017, investigative journalists revealed that Aspen Pharmacare, a major drug company, plotted to destroy supplies of cheap cancer medications in order to drive the prices up by 4,000%. In other cases, blood products known to carry high risks of HIV or hepatitis were dumped into poorer markets abroad. as happened when Bayer sold tainted clotting factor to patients in Asia and Latin America while selling a safer product in the West. The point isn't that medicine is bad. It's that when life and death intersect with profit margins, the results can be catastrophic. Patients are left wondering, is my prescription what I need, or what makes someone else money? Is my doctor being guided by science, or by subtle incentives and manipulative marketing? When conspiracy theorists say big pharma is corrupt, it's easy to imagine they mean shadowy cabals, secret potions, and microchips activated by 5G. The reality is much more boring and more damning. The corruption is in the emails, the sales training manuals, and the boardroom decisions. I think it's the same thing as the banking system. The conspiracy theory is the business model. So what do all of these stories, MK-Ultra, Tuskegee, Operation Northwoods, COINTELPRO, false flags, media manipulation, corporate crimes, environmental cover-ups, and big pharma scandals actually mean? Beyond the shock value, beyond the anger, and beyond the 3 views I'll get, what's the takeaway? First, it's that history has repeatedly proven that the label conspiracy theory is often a weapon. It's used to dismiss uncomfortable truths, to silence critics, and to keep people from asking the wrong questions. For decades, people who spoke about CIA mind control or government disease experiments were ridiculed. Then the documents came out, the whistleblower spoke, and suddenly the ridicule turned into horror. What was once crazy talk from your weird uncle at family dinners became the evening news. Secondly, it shows us that power, whether in the form of governments, corporations, or intelligence agencies, will almost always push past ethical boundaries if left unchecked. Whether it's dosing prisoners with LSD, spraying cities with bacteria, covering up lead in water, or bribing doctors to prescribe addictive drugs, the pattern is the same. When there's secrecy, when there's money, when there's national security on the line, ordinary people, like you and me, become expendable. I think third, and most importantly, these stories remind us that skepticism is not cynicism. It's not about believing everything is a lie. It's about recognizing that institutions have lied before, that they've been caught, and that blind trust is a luxury history shows us we can't afford. Healthy skepticism means demanding transparency, accountability, and oversight, not retreating into some kind of nihilism, but refusing to be lulled into complacency. I think the bigger point is that all of this isn't ancient history. The same forces, intelligence agencies, corporations, media manipulation, and surveillance states still exist today. They've just gotten a lot better at what they do. More digital, more subtle. Today it's about metadata and algorithmic feeds. If Operation Mockingbird was about placing journalists, today it's about shaping entire platforms and influencers. The tools evolve, but the mindset remains the same. And that leaves us with a question. Not just what happened, but what now? Because if history proves that conspiracies can be real, then the responsibility is on us to remember, to stay alert, to hold power accountable, and to build systems where lies have a harder time surviving. I think that's the only way a democracy or any free society can function. So the next time you hear someone laugh off a conspiracy theory, please remember this. Sometimes the difference between a joke and a headline is just time. And the only reason we know the truth about the past is because some people kept asking questions when everyone else told them to shut up. If you've been listening this whole time, thank you. And don't go too far, because if you thought MK-Ultra was strange, wait till you hear about the time the Pentagon tried to train psychic spies, or when the CIA mapped out how to leave your body on command, or the classified research into UFOs, portals, and whatever was happening at Skinwalker Ranch. That's right, after this kind of boring rant about conspiracies, I'm going to try to talk about the government's real experiments with the paranormal. You've seen the receipts for the mind control and the media manipulation, and now we're following the paper trail into the weird. And the next chapter, it's not sci-fi, it's just declassified. So stay curious, stay skeptical, and I'll see you on the other side.